Jessica Camilleri, a woman from Sydney, Australia, decapitated her mother in a tragic incident on the night of July 20th, 2019. Having faced humiliation at school due to her apparent cognitive delays and learning difficulties, Jessica retreated into resentment. She developed aggressive behaviors when feeling threatened or when she thought she was being mistreated, which could range from a stranger's glance to her mother's refusal to give her extra food. Her paranoia grew, fueled by an obsession with horror movies like the 1974 Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This film, known for its intense violence, was banned in several countries, including Australia and the UK. It's about a group of young people in Texas being chased by chainsaw-wielding cannibals. On that fateful Saturday night, Jessica used 7 kitchen knives to stab her mother in the skull, decapitate her, and then threw her head into a neighbor's yard. After the act, she shockingly asked the police if a doctor could sew her mother's head back on to bring her back to life. Jessica Camilleri was the second daughter of Rita and Vince, an Australian Maltese couple. Unlike her older sister Christy, Jessica was born with a mental disability. While the average person's IQ ranges between 90 and 110, Jessica's was between 55 and 60, placing her in the bottom 1% and categorizing her mental delay as mild. People with mild intellectual disability often learn to speak, read, write, and do math later than others, but they can still communicate and express themselves in daily life. Jessica was late in reaching developmental milestones like walking, talking, and coordinating movements. Due to her condition, she was enrolled in school much later than her peers, facing early on the discomfort, teasing, and bullying from classmates for being different. Jessica dealt with the resulting stress and anxiety through anger, particularly towards females, and developed intermittent explosive disorder. This condition is marked by sudden, repeated outbursts of impulsive, aggressive, and violent behavior, as well as angry verbal eruptions that are grossly out of proportion to the situation. Intermittent explosive disorder usually appears by the age of 6 and intensifies during adolescence and early adulthood. It's not just a normal tantrum, but a mental disorder linked to a lack of serotonin, the mood-regulating hormone in the brain. At school, Jessica lashed out at students and teachers alike, once biting a male student and refusing to let go, leading to her indefinite suspension and confinement at home under her mother Rita's care, supported by a disability pension. Besides intellectual disability and irrational bursts of fury, Jessica also suffered from attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, a chronic brain condition that affects millions of children worldwide and makes it hard to control her behavior. She was also diagnosed with severe bipolar disorder, depression, and anxiety. Furthermore, Jessica had autism spectrum disorders, affecting her judgment, awareness of thoughts, feelings, and empathy towards others. Autism made simple daily activities like shopping, using public transport, banking, and working difficult for her. Jessica had obsessions, such as with her 3 favorite numbers, 2, 3, and 5, which she associated with her favorite colors, yellow, green, and purple, respectively. She liked to repeat these numbers to create random phone numbers to dial, often trying to talk to men. Once, she called a family's home in Bangladesh, India, up to 100 times a day, just because she liked their phone number. In 2018, she began harassing the staff of a meat company in Daylesford, England, even threatening the company owner Matthew Layfield's family, claiming she would decapitate them with a chainsaw. Jessica's fascination with horror movies was another unchecked obsession. She spent hours, days, months, and years rewatching gruesome videos, especially fixated on films like Saw, Jeepers Creepers, and her favorite, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974, about young people in Texas chased by chainsaw-wielding cannibals. This movie was banned in several countries, including Australia and the UK, for its violence. When her mother Rita restricted her from these films, Jessica would become furious with her. Jessica and her mother Rita lived alone in a house in St. Clair, a suburb of Sydney in New South Wales, Australia. Vince, Jessica's father, divorced Rita during Jessica's teenage years because of the continuous behavioral problems of their daughter. The marriage couldn't withstand Jessica's outbursts, leading to its downfall. Despite Jessica's low self-esteem and her childish and naive personality, she exhibited strong narcissistic traits. Deep down, she believed she was unique and deserved special treatment because of her mental disability, which sometimes made her exploitative and egocentric. Rita, however, was unwavering in her care. She knew her daughter had issues but felt it was her duty to look after and protect her. Rita even reached out to apologize to one of the victims of Jessica's harassing phone calls, admitting she was at her wits' end and unsure how to control her daughter. Although Jessica loved her family, she was especially close to her mother, who catered to all her needs and chose to keep her at home instead of placing her in a psychiatric facility for full-time care. Rita's life revolved around Jessica. According to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, 1 in 5 Australians, or 20% of the population, approximately 4.8 million people, reported having a mental or behavioral condition between July 2017 and June 2018. Women reported a higher proportion of mental or behavioral conditions than men, and young people aged 15 to 24 had the highest proportion of mental or behavioral conditions. Mental illness refers to a clinically diagnosable disorder that affects a person's cognitive, emotional, or social abilities. It encompasses a range of conditions, including depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and psychotic disorders. These conditions significantly impact an individual's emotions and how they interact with their community, affecting not only the individuals themselves but also their families and caregivers. The tragic event of July 20th, 2019 was not an isolated incident. 6 years before the calamity struck the Camilleri family, Jessica had been convicted on a couple of occasions for common assaults causing actual bodily harm. She had also previously attacked an aunt and her sister's mother-in-law by pulling their hair. However, she was never jailed. Instead, she was always left in the care of the one person who could tolerate her, her mother, Rita. Jessica had also been aggressive towards women in the streets and shopping centers who she perceived as looking at her wrongly or making her feel ashamed. She was once barred from a doctor's office after becoming paranoid and violent towards another patient in the waiting room. In early 2018, during a visit to the hospital with Rita, Jessica attacked a nurse. Jessica was admitted to a mental health unit for 9 days due to a severe mood disorder episode and was treated with lithium for supposed bipolar disorder, along with antipsychotic medications. By the end of 2018, about 6 months before the crime, Jessica had stopped taking her medication and started using natural remedies to manage her conditions. Rita was so desperate that she paid $2,500 to a medium on Queen Street in St. Mary's, a western suburb of Sydney, hoping to exorcise the demon she believed was inside Jessica. Rita's family and friends repeatedly warned her about the dangers of living with Jessica, but Rita insisted her daughter wouldn't harm a fly. Christy, Jessica's older sister, described their mother Rita as having a heart of gold, always putting others before herself, including Jessica, who repeatedly refused professional help. Rita's sister also recognized Rita's unconditional love for Jessica and often expressed concern that Jessica might harm her. However, Rita's motherly love blinded her to these warnings, ignoring them even the day before the fatal attack when she had to take Jessica to a police station because her daughter had made threatening calls to strangers again. On July 20th, 2019, Jessica felt humiliated by her mother in front of a man who merely walked past them in a parking lot. After visiting her sister, the two women returned home. Jessica asked her mother to order another round of food from Red Rooster, but Rita refused. Jessica then called the restaurant herself 3 times at 9:18, 9:20, and finally at 9:21 p.m. Jessica also asked her mother to call a doctor to come to their house. Rita complied, but the doctor fled the home, terrified by Jessica's behavior, which chased him until he managed to escape in his car. Rita, out of patience and options, told Jessica she would call the emergency number and request an ambulance to take her immediately to the mental health care system. Jessica's worst episode of rage was about to unfold. That night of July 20th, 2019, 57-year-old Rita was dragged by her hair to the kitchen of her own home by Jessica. Using 7 meat cleavers, 4 of which broke, Jessica stabbed her mother over 100 times in the head and neck. This act of mutilation was driven by more than uncontrollable anger. It reflected Jessica's macabre curiosity, influenced by her obsession with the horror films she watched daily. The forensic pathologist's autopsy revealed that Rita had suffered monumental injuries to her head and neck and died from multiple stab wounds with decapitation at the second vertebra in her upper neck. Rita's body also had over 90 defensive wounds, indicating she was conscious for a significant part of the attack, experiencing extreme physical pain and emotional terror from what her daughter, whom she had devotedly cared for, was doing. During this gruesome scene, Jessica's nephew, the 4-year-old son of her older sister Christy, was present. He had been under Rita's care for a few days due to Jessica's seeming improvement. The boy witnessed Jessica stabbing his grandmother multiple times and decapitating her. When he tried to intervene, Jessica, whom he called the little bastard, slightly injured him in the head. The young boy started vomiting upon witnessing the horrific scene. After killing her mother, Jessica called the emergency number from Rita's cell phone and confessed to murdering her mother, claiming self-defense, alleging that Rita had attacked her first. Then, Jessica felt she had to act fast and began repeatedly stabbing her mother. After decapitating and stabbing her mother over 100 times, Jessica dumped the head in a nearby neighbor's front yard. When the police arrived at the house in St. Clair, Sydney, New South Wales, Jessica was outside, her clothes stained with Rita's blood, holding a water bottle. She showed no remorse for her actions, only worrying about what would happen to her next. Jessica asked the police officers and later the detectives at the crime scene if it was possible to bring someone back to life who had been decapitated, believing in the possibility of medical miracles that could reattach her mother's head. A police officer responded that this idea was rather unrealistic, yet Jessica insisted, thinking that doctors could perform miraculous surgeries and reattach her mother's head. She also inquired if she would face any consequences, like the death penalty, for killing her mother. When told that Australia does not have capital punishment, Jessica felt relieved. She also confessed to the police that the idea of decapitating her mother came from the horror movies she watched compulsively. This chilling conversation was recorded on the body camera of a police officer when he arrived at the scene at 11:43 p.m. on July 20th, 2019. First responders described the scene as one of the most horrific they had ever encountered. The day after the crime, on July 21, 2019, Jessica appeared at the court but did not apply for bail. A friend told the media that this was not surprising, as Jessica likely did not understand what bail meant. After a trial highlighting her long history of mental illness, Jessica was found guilty of manslaughter in December 2020, having pleaded not guilty to murder due to disability. In early 2021, she was sentenced to a maximum of 21 years and 7 months in prison, with a non-parole period of 16 years and 2 months, making her eligible for parole on September 19, 2035. The prosecutor told the court that Rita's gruesome murder was the peak of a lifetime of escalating violence from Jessica, progressing from hair-pulling to a deadly explosive attack. He also argued that Jessica was assessed as a moderate to high risk of reoffending and remained a continuous danger to the community. Christy, Jessica's older sister, stated that Jessica had killed and butchered their mother and that she could never forgive her for her actions. Rita's sister hoped that Jessica would receive the necessary help and that Rita could rest in peace, knowing Jessica was cared for by a system that had failed her in life. The case judge offered counseling services to the jury members, acknowledging that the distressing evidence they had heard could stay with them long after the trial. The judge acknowledged that during the jury selection process, many individuals refused to participate in a trial like Jessica's. She also stated that Rita's murder was one of the most severe cases of homicide a court could encounter. She described it as a crime of extraordinary cruelty and brutality, exacerbated by its occurrence in the victim's own home. Jessica's lawyer mentioned that his client had expressed remorse in a letter sent to her family after the crime. In the letter, Jessica admitted that Rita had not hit her and acknowledged that it was her fault that her mother was no longer alive. However, one of the psychiatrists who evaluated her noted that Jessica did not use social gestures to communicate and displayed a rather mild lack of emotion on her face. The psychiatrist also found no signs of schizophrenia or auditory or visual hallucinations in Jessica. The conclusion reached was that Jessica's risk factors could only be managed over the long term with a comprehensive mental health support plan. Jessica was placed in the most stringent unit of the women's section at the correctional complex. Since entering prison, Jessica has continued to cause trouble. On September 9, 2019, just 2 months after her arrival, she threw a teacup at another inmate following a disagreement over food trading. The next day, she was charged with assault at the local court but received no additional punishment. On October 14, 2019, she attacked another inmate, resulting in 5 days of solitary confinement in her cell. On November 3, 2019, she disobeyed an order, and on July 31, 2020, she damaged property, incurring a fine of $200 Australian. Another assault on November 21, 2020, led to 7 days in solitary, and in January 2021, she was convicted of common assault again without any further sanction. Jessica has defended her actions, stating that no matter what she does or where she goes, other prisoners will make her life miserable. She also mentioned that prison life is tough and not like the outside world. Mental health issues are prevalent among prisoners. According to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, 40% of Australian prisoners had a diagnosed mental illness in 2018. Furthermore, statistics show that 1 in 5 people with mental illnesses will interact with the criminal justice system at some point in their lives. While there is no direct causal link between having a mental health condition and committing a crime, these figures indicate that many individuals in Australian prisons had pre-existing mental health conditions. Research shows that people with mental illnesses are more likely to commit crimes, particularly those with psychotic disorders, as such episodes can lead to criminal behavior. Symptoms of bipolar disorder can be directly related to criminal acts, and extreme anxiety or stress can increase the likelihood of violent behavior due to heightened anger, agitation, or impulsivity. However, there's another side to this. The prison environment can worsen pre-existing mental health conditions, with violence and brutality from other inmates or prison staff potentially triggering or exacerbating mental health issues. According to the Australia Policy Development Centre, a prison is a dreadful place for someone with a mental illness. In Sydney Supreme Court on May 15, 2023, Justice Peter Hamill dismissed claims that Camilleri's sentence was manifestly excessive and that the sentencing judge had been incorrect in assessing the gravity of the crime. Justice Hamill nonetheless ruled that Camilleri should be resentenced, with support from Justices Christine Adamson and Richard Kavanaugh. He considered that her behavior of walking into the street with her mother's head and dropping it, as well as asking emergency services personnel whether they could reattach it, demonstrated the extent to which her conduct was divorced from the real world. Based on the evidence of multiple psychiatrists and a psychologist, Justice Hamill found Camilleri had only a simple understanding of moral wrongfulness due to her intellectual disability and autism spectrum disorder. He ordered that she be resentenced to a prison term of 16 years with a non-parole period of 12 years. And so, dear viewers, this concludes today's episode of Unreal True Crime. Please remember to subscribe and like if you appreciate my work. Good night, and I'll see you in the next crime story. On November 15, 2013, Chris called 911. He said he had arrived home and found his parents unresponsive in their truck. Chris said that Roger was coughing and that Melissa's head was bobbing up and down. He said they were alive but barely moving. The dispatcher asked Chris to put them on their backs to try to administer CPR. Roger and Melissa had both been shot in the right side of their heads. Melissa Blumel died the next day, and Roger Blumel died about 5 weeks later. Roger Blumel was born on January 17, 1965, into a household bustling with many members, including his parents and 7 children, 6 boys and a girl. Roger's family was not only large but also very united, raised with a strong sense of values and community life. Even while still in high school, Roger proved to be a hard-working young man with goals for the future. He began driving his father's truck and, after graduating from the local high school, worked in concrete transportation. Later, he discovered that his true calling was in sales, a field in which he eventually found success. According to his friends, he was one of those people capable of selling ice to Eskimos. This skill was also accompanied by a generous, cheerful, and extroverted personality. He always seemed happy, and nothing pleased him more than making everyone around him have a big smile on their faces. Roger had a good life and an excellent relationship with his family. The only thing missing was a partner, and one day he achieved that too. The details are not specified, but a close friend later recounted that at the end of the evening when he met a young woman who captivated him, Roger declared with absolute resolution that she was the woman he was going to marry. The girl in question was named Melissa. She was born in Wichita on January 1st, 1960. Her childhood, too, was spent in a loving family comprised of 3 girls and 3 boys, though a younger sister died before reaching her first birthday. Melissa was a sweet, hard-working girl, always ready to help not just her family but everyone around her. She began working as a cashier at a bank where she made a successful career. In the following years, her seriousness, commitment, and sense of collaboration earned her several promotions that led her to become the vice president of the bank. That first meeting marked the beginning of the union of 2 soulmates who married in 1991. Life for the Blumels seemed perfect as Melissa climbed the ranks within the bank, and Roger's charm led him to establish his own business. Roger loved to share time with friends and bring joy to everyone around him. In Melissa, he found the perfect companion. Moreover, both had a strong social consciousness that led them to collaborate and participate in any charitable, sports, or collective activity that took place in their community. However, as we've seen in almost all stories, a perfect life does not exist, and for the Blumels, the only thing missing was a child to bring laughter and joy to their loving home. Unfortunately, this desire remained elusive for the couple, and after years of unsuccessfully trying to conceive, Roger and Melissa began to consider the idea of adopting a child. With this intention, they contacted a local social worker. Their wishes were heard, and doubly so, as a woman named Keisha Schaberg had put up her 2 sons for adoption. Anthony, 7 years old, whom everyone called Tony, and Christopher, 4 years old, known as Chris. Keisha's idea was to place them in an open adoption so she could maintain contact with her sons and the family raising them. However, the Blumels did not consider this the best option, as they wanted to raise the children as their own and completely remove them from what had been a tough start in life. In the end, Roger and Melissa's approach prevailed, and from that moment, Tony and Chris formally became part of the Blumel family, starting to enjoy a life they never knew existed. In fact, it was later known that Tony was amazed he was allowed to have dinner every day. The children quickly adapted and began to enjoy their new life. They attended elementary school and successfully completed that stage as good students. In high school, they were also successful, had no problems with their peers, were fully integrated and made a wide group of friends, and excelled in sports, particularly in wrestling and football. Tony made rapid progress in wrestling, securing second place in a competition in his division. At that time, everything seemed to promise a bright future for the boys and a happy life for the whole family. But the Blumels' world began to turn upside down when Tony reached his senior year of high school. The young man began to change what had until then been exemplary behavior. He turned into someone who was constantly in conflict with his parents, accusing them of always favoring his younger brother Chris. From then on, he engaged in alcohol consumption, disregarded curfews, and even smoked marijuana. Things in the Blumel household became chaotic, and soon it seemed that the last hope for the young man to correct his path was lost. For a long time, Tony had expressed a fervent desire to join the United States Air Force after finishing high school. But this dream dissipated due to his own behavior when, in 2013, he was arrested for an unspecified act of aggression, and shortly after graduating, again for driving under the influence of alcohol. With these records, he could say goodbye to a future in military aviation. These events did not lead Tony to reflect. On the contrary, it plunged him into a downward spiral. Once he graduated from high school, his life had no direction. He did not want to continue studying, nor did he want to work. In fact, he wanted to do nothing more than sleep late and spend the rest of his day immersed in a cloud of cannabis smoke. Melissa lived in terror of the boy's outbursts of rage, and amidst all this situation, which was so difficult to bear, there was something else that the Bloomels did not know. Since the spring of 2013, through social media, Keisha had been contacting her biological sons. While it seems Chris either rejected Keisha's friend request or was not very receptive to communicating with his biological mother, Tony not only accepted immediately, but was also completely excited to reconnect with his real mother. Keisha had been devastated after giving her sons to the Bloomels. Although she was relieved to know that both had been welcomed into the same good family and would stay together, she could not resign herself to the lack of contact. Reconnecting with her eldest son filled Keisha with excitement, but at the same time she developed a great resentment towards the Bloomels, believing that they had turned Chris against her. However, this feeling was undoubtedly overshadowed by the happiness of reconnecting with her firstborn. Additionally, the news of Tony's problems with his adoptive parents fueled Keisha's hope of reuniting with her son, and she wasted no time in offering him to come to see her. Meanwhile, at the adoptive family's home, far from improving, things were getting worse. The conflict reached a point of no return when one day, in the midst of one of his fits of rage, Tony punched a hole in a wall. This was the turning point for the Bloomels. They could no longer risk their own safety and that of Chris. After several unsuccessful discussions trying to put an end to the eldest son's behaviors, Roger and Melissa came to the difficult decision to tell Tony that he had to leave the house. The young man initially wandered aimlessly but soon realized he had to do something to sustain himself, so he got some jobs at fast food restaurants and supplemented those meager earnings by selling cannabis. Although he slept like a nomad from night to night at some friends' houses, he ended up associating with a group of youths who were deeply involved in excessive drug use. And amid all these despairing events, a lifeline suddenly appeared for Tony when Keisha told him to come to California to live with her. Tony eagerly accepted the invitation, and the reunion took place in September 2013 at Keisha's house in California. The young man was accompanied by his best friend from high school, Braden, who had dropped out in his junior year to dedicate himself to drug dealing. The two young men were excited because they arrived with the hope of having Keisha's support, who was also versed in the drug trade, to start a large marijuana business in the area, and they even talked about entering the medical cannabis market. The reality was that the two young men had arrived to live in a small apartment which had only one room. It is not hard to imagine that the situation in the place began to be tense, particularly because Sean, Keisha's partner, had 2 jobs and was the only one bringing in money to cover the expenses for 5 people. Keisha only contributed a part of the social assistance she received for her daughter. Keisha, Tony, and Braden spent their days using drugs, and the woman's younger daughter was all the time under that bad influence. Logically, at one point things reached an unacceptable limit, something that happened when Sean found out that Tony and Braden were selling marijuana near her house. She let them know that what they were doing was simply unacceptable and dangerous for her as the property owner. Consequently, she told them to take their drugs elsewhere. Additionally, after this episode, Sean gave an ultimatum to the house occupants. Everyone had to get a job or leave the apartment. Far from making the group reflect, as was her intention, what it achieved was that they formed an alliance to show indignation towards her. They decided to leave the apartment and go to a nearby hotel for 2 weeks. But that was not the solution either, because without having an income, after those weeks they had no means to sustain the hotel payment. The need for money did not make them consider working decently. The first idea they had was to return to Kansas, perhaps because it was familiar territory for Tony in terms of drug dealing. After almost a day on the road, the group decided to stop in Arizona and spend the night at a hotel. It was there that Tony told his travel companions that he had come up with an idea which was to end the lives of his adoptive parents to claim the inheritance. Once they arrived in Wichita and found accommodation at a hotel they rented for a month, they dedicated themselves to refining the details of that idea. It was a simple solution. They had to end the lives of Roger and Melissa, claim the insurance, sell the assets, and use the resources to start a new, larger-scale drug business. Tony was convinced that the original family, which he had returned to, would become rich by cultivating and selling marijuana. Tony even proposed a perfect day to carry out the crime. It would be Friday, November 15th of that year, 2013, as his brother Chris would not be at home, as he had to attend an event related to his wrestling practice. Tony had been a star in that discipline and still maintained contact with some team members, which is how he learned about his brother's commitment that night. Gradually, the plan was formed, in which Tony would communicate with Roger and Melissa and invite them somewhere with the excuse of talking about what had happened between them and try to fix things. Tony's idea was that, while there was no one at home, Braden would take Keisha to the residence so she could enter and steal some valuables. Tony also knew where his adoptive parents kept a significant amount of money for emergencies. The idea was that the act would appear to be a robbery gone wrong. But from the beginning, the final intention was clear. When Roger and Melissa returned home, Keisha would end their lives. Everyone thought it was an excellent plan, but later, Braden backed out. He did not want to participate in the act, but agreed to help by acquiring the guns they would need. As a substitute, he recommended a friend of his, also a former high school peer named Andrew, who could take on the role as the driver to take Keisha to the Blumels' residence. As promised, Braden procured 2 pistols purchased from other criminals. It should be mentioned that there was never any intention to share the money with Andrew, who was agreed to be paid $1,000 to act essentially as a driver and support for Keisha in the robbery. In the end, she would be the executor. In early November, Keisha posted on her social networks a photo of her with Tony and a caption that read, "A bond that cannot be broken." Finally, the day arrived. It was Friday, November 15th, 2013, and as Tony had predicted, his wonderful adoptive parents did not refuse to meet with him. The meeting went peacefully. While at the Blumels' house, the scene was completely different. As soon as Roger and Melissa left for the meeting, Keisha and Andrew entered the house, forced the garage door, and began to rummage through everything. They took the opportunity to take some small, valuable items and the cash the couple kept in the house for any eventuality. Once the first part of the plan was carried out, Keisha and Andrew hid beside the secluded residence to wait for their victims to arrive. They soon received a call from Tony, informing them that the meeting had ended, that his adoptive parents had dropped him off at the hotel, and they were on their way home. The wait was not too long. As soon as the Blumels' vehicle stopped in front of the parking gate, the 2 attackers came out of their hiding place. Keisha immediately positioned herself on Melissa's side, while Andrew aimed at Roger to keep him still. Melissa, still surprised, recognized the mother of the children they had adopted more than 10 years ago to provide love, stability, and a better future. She only managed to say, "Oh my God, Keisha," when a precise shot to the head made her collapse in the seat. Roger, completely disconcerted, tried to assist his wife. Meanwhile, Keisha reached the man's window and pulled the trigger towards Roger's head, but the gun jammed. The woman made several attempts to shoot while he was frozen, with the slumped body of his wife next to him. Finally, the gun fired, and Roger also collapsed next to the one who had been the best partner for his life project. Once the fatal plan was carried out, Keisha and Andrew boarded the vehicle they had arrived in and quickly left. The Blumel spouses remained there until around 9:15 p.m., when Chris returned from his meeting and found the terrible scene. He immediately called 911, reporting that he had just arrived home and found his parents practically unconscious inside their van. The young man stated that Roger was coughing and that Melissa was bobbing her head up and down. Both had gunshot marks on their heads. The dispatcher instructed him to try resuscitation maneuvers while emergency services arrived a few minutes later and took over the situation. Miraculously, the Blumels were still alive, but their lives were hanging by a thread, so they were immediately transported to a hospital. While all this was happening, upon returning to the hotel where they were staying, Keisha seemed to have a panic attack and stated that all she needed was to consume some illicit substance, and she did so accompanied by the other boys. Also, at that moment, Keisha handed over the used gun and a wallet of Melissa's that she had stolen from the house to be disposed of in a nearby stream. Andrew threw the items into the pond of a nearby park. The following day, Tony began using the money stolen from his adoptive parents' home to start trafficking marijuana, earning his first $100. Unfortunately, that same day, Melissa lost her battle and passed away at the age of 53. Tony also went to the hospital to see his father, but what he did not know is that sometime before, he had been removed from both the Blumels' will and their insurance policies. Consequently, the two heinous crimes had been committed in vain. In the following days, it was also discovered that Andrew had not been paid and was even unaware that Keisha had taken cash from the Blumel family's home. Eventually, fate caught up with them. In the initial inspections of the Blumel residence, the police noticed that the garage door had been forced open, and inside the home everything was in disarray. There were items scattered everywhere. It was confirmed that money, jewelry, and other items had been stolen. The authorities wondered if the attack on the spouses had been a result of them arriving while the thieves were still in the house. However, the fatal assault had occurred before the couple entered the home, so this initial hypothesis was dismissed. In the van where Roger and Melissa were attacked, there were no significant fingerprints, although investigators did find a bullet casing. Then, the authorities turned their attention towards the victims' workplaces, thinking perhaps an upset client had sought revenge. But this theory was also discarded, so it was time to talk to people close to the couple. The first on the detectives' list was Tony, as he had been the last person seen alive with the victims. But the young man insisted he knew nothing and had not participated in the act. According to him, after finishing dinner, he had gone straight back to the hotel where he was staying with his mother. This information was confirmed by the staff at the tolls. The second on the list was Chris, who had found the bodies, but he was quickly dismissed after verifying his statement that at the time of the incident, he was at a dinner with members of the wrestling team. However, the investigators found something strange in the young man's behavior. He didn't seem overly disturbed and instead appeared to be lost in thought. When the police pursued this direction and asked him what he thought had happened to his parents, Chris immediately replied that there was only one person who came to mind. He added that the only one who might hold any grudge against their parents and perhaps be capable of such an act was his older brother, Tony. With this significant lead, the authorities got a lucky break in their search for the culprits. A man contacted the police to say that a young man who was a friend of Tony had approached him intending to buy a gun. The detectives focused on this individual, and upon checking his background found he had a long history related to drugs. Moreover, they discovered he had traveled to California along with Tony. It was Braden. Sooner rather than later, Braden received a message from his family informing him that the sheriff's office investigators were looking to interrogate him about what had happened to the Blumels. The morning after receiving this information, Braden went to the police station. A press report states that on his way to the police station, he stopped by a pond to throw away something, apparently the guns used in the crime, which had not been disposed of as planned. According to this account, he was already under surveillance, and when the police searched the water, they found in the bag he threw a pistol that had not been fired in the attack. Braden's interrogation lasted for 3 days. At first, the young man maintained he had nothing to do with the incident, but he couldn't withstand the pressure from the authorities and ended up confessing everything he knew, stating that the idea for the attack had been Tony's. Tony Blumel, 18 years old, and his biological mother, Keisha, 35, were arrested on November 19th at the hotel where they were staying. Additionally, Andrew, then 18 years old, was arrested. And finally, Braden, also 18, was put behind bars on November 20th of that same year, 2013. At that time, Keisha did not admit her participation in the robbery and other crimes, although the 3 young men confessed what had happened. On November 25, 2013, the accused made their first appearance before the court via video conference. On that occasion, they were all charged with the same offenses: first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, 2 counts of aggravated robbery, burglary, and theft. The 3 young men were set a bail of $500,000, and for Keisha, the bail was set at $1 million. On December 21st, Roger's heart stopped beating, and at 48 years old, he joined his beloved Melissa. And after Roger's death, the situation for the woman and the 3 young men worsened, as they could be charged with capital murder, which could imply a death penalty sentence. Indeed, on January 3, 2014, the 4 detainees were formally charged with a count of capital murder for being the alleged perpetrators of the death of more than 1 person in the same incident. Additionally, Keisha was charged with 2 counts of aggravated robbery, 1 count of burglary, and 1 count of theft. The preliminary hearing took place on July 17th of that same year. By that time, Braden had negotiated with the authorities, and in exchange for a benefit in his sentence, he ended up becoming the prosecution's star witness. After a year of negotiations, not only did Braden reach an agreement, but 2 other individuals involved in the crime also negotiated with the prosecution. According to the agreements reached, the accused would not dispute the charges against them and would waive their right to appeal their sentences. In exchange, the prosecution agreed not to seek the death penalty and to drop some charges. Starting in mid-2015, in separate hearings, each confirmed their decision to plead guilty. The judge sentenced Keisha to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the capital murder charge, and additionally to 122 months in prison for 2 counts of aggravated robbery. The sentences would be served consecutively. In her opportunity to speak, she stated she deeply regretted what had happened and lamented everything the Blumel family had to go through. The rest of her statement was controversial, as she claimed she had nothing to do with the incident, having no anger towards the Blumels. On the contrary, she had the utmost respect for them, as they had given Tony and Chris a wonderful life, and she would always be grateful for that. According to official records to this day, Keisha remains detained in a high-security level correctional facility. The second to face his fate was her son, Anthony Blumel, known to everyone as Tony, who received the same sentence as his mother. During the sentencing hearing, Tony, who declined to speak when given the opportunity, heard the victim impact statement made by his aunt, Christina Blumel, who thanked the authorities for administering justice and referred to all the love that Roger and Melissa had given the boy. In complete silence, Tony listened to Christina's heartfelt words, and at one moment, tears almost sprang from the young criminal's eyes. In the end, The woman told Tony that he had chosen his path without anyone forcing him to make those decisions. She added that perhaps one day he might understand his choices, or perhaps he never would. Tony has been since then in a correctional facility. His record up to this moment listed a significant number of prison infractions related to smuggling, fights, unauthorized phone use, explicit sex, theft, and disobedience, among others. A week after these sentences, it was Andrew's turn, the only one who did not agree to acknowledge his responsibility and was found guilty of first and second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, plus 155 months. Finally, Braden, the last of the participants in the incident and who from the beginning had reached an agreement with the prosecution, was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 24.5 years in prison. According to his official record, his first opportunity for release will be on May 28, 2035. However, his prison record shows that far from reforming, Braden had received 71 disciplinary reports for disobedience, threats to others, stimulant use, intoxication, possession of tobacco contraband, theft, and dangerous smuggling, among other causes. In the end, the district attorney expressed satisfaction with the outcome of this case. It's worth noting that even though she had waived that right, Keisha attempted to appeal her sentences unsuccessfully. At the end of this story, only one thing remains undisputed. The lives of two wonderful people, Roger and Melissa Blumel, were cut short with a terrible and unnecessary ending. The bitterness, or perhaps the guilt of a woman who led a life of excess for which she gave up her children for adoption, was the genesis of the tragedy. She couldn't bear that one of her descendants wanted nothing more to do with her, which apparently led her to direct her anger at the people who gave all their love and well-being to her children. For his part, Tony repaid all the love and care received from that couple with resentment, envy, and violence, resorting to an unjustifiable path of substance abuse, and finally, a double crime. Keisha's younger daughter ended up being sent to a foster home. As for Chris Blumel, he managed to overcome what happened and has led a good life with the support of the family. And well, dear audience, that concludes today's case. Before you go, leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to share this video if you think someone you know might be interested. See you in another episode of Unreal True Crime. Goodbye. A 63-year-old woman arrived home to find her daughter and her boyfriend, both minors, locked in a room. Surprised and angered, she confronted them about their behavior. What no one could have imagined was that this argument would escalate into a violent fight between the couple and the mother, resulting in a scenario akin to the most horrific horror movie. Vilma Gabriela Niño de Guzmán de la Rosa was born in Peru in the late 1940s. She married José Tejada Ramírez, a man 21 years her senior. José had an older son from his first marriage. After they started living, he increasingly started distancing from his previous family, including his son. Vilma had a strong and reserved character. In contrast, she was a woman who reserved all her tenderness and dedication for the plants in her garden. Caring for them meticulously, talking to them and observing them daily was an activity that offered her unparalleled peace. When she finally felt the call of motherhood, it was not easy for her to fulfill her dream. José was over 70 years old while she had already passed her most fertile age. However, she was not one to give up easily. Thus, the couple decided to undergo fertility treatment. Finally, after a long struggle, at 49, Vilma received what she considered the best news of her life. She was pregnant. Later, when the couple learned they were expecting a girl, Jose felt tremendous joy. It seemed like a miracle, one he could never have imagined at his age. For her part, Vilma promised to be the best mother possible for the child. The little girl came into the world at the start of the new millennium, and they named her Stephanie. Healthy, rosy-cheeked, and cheerful, as the girl grew, she confirmed to her parents that the decision to have her had been the best. With her smile and vivacity, awakened in both a new energy and tenderness they had not known before. Over time, the girl proved to be very coquettish, feminine, and a fashion lover. Although the exact date is unknown, Jose suffered a stroke. While he survived, the aftermath was significant, as Jose was left disabled and was later diagnosed with senile dementia. Meanwhile, Vilma had to face raising her daughter alone. Her ambition was for Stephanie to become a righteous woman and, hopefully, a future doctor in medicine. However, as often happens, Stephanie's entry into puberty brought changes in her behavior. It was 2012, and suddenly, the once sweet and warm girl began showing signs of rebellion. As expected, this transformation also disrupted the mother-daughter relationship. Suddenly, that residence became the scene of constant confrontations that grew more frequent over time. Most of these fights occurred when Vilma forbade her daughter from going out with friends. For Stephanie, being locked up at home was tormenting, even perceiving it as a prison. In April of that same year, the young girl took an interest in another student from her high school named Fernando. He was a fairly calm boy, with many friends and no history of violence or rebellious behavior. When they met, it was love at first sight for him. Stephanie was not only a beautiful girl, but also confident and decisive. Thus, they quickly became a couple. At 15, Fernando felt on top of the world, capable of anything. But sometime later, everything changed. By the end of 2012, the relationship between the teenagers was tumultuous, as evidenced by a letter that Stephanie wrote to him. In her own handwriting, the young girl boasted of knowing her own charms perfectly, making it clear that if he didn't measure up, she could easily replace him with another boy. Although Vilma learned of her daughter's relationship, she initially tried not to interfere. After all, she believed it was likely just a fleeting, insignificant romance typical of Stephanie's age. But months passed with no sign of the affair ending. Meanwhile, Stephanie took control of the relationship, knowing how to dominate Fernando. She liked to give orders and, of course, to be obeyed. When this did not happen, she punished him, scratching him, justifying it by saying he well deserved it. Far from leaving her, or at least reacting, Fernando endured the situation, hopelessly in love, to the point of even setting aside his preferences, dignity, or social life. Because by then, the relationship also distanced him from his friends. Judging by some leaked text messages, the young man felt lost and, in essence, suffered greatly after each fight with his girlfriend. An example of this is an audio message Fernando sent to Stephanie at 2 a.m. on January 6, 2013. Besides showing how insecure he was regarding her feelings, Fernando said some quite worrying things, talking about ending someone's life and seeking his girlfriend's support for these ideas. Although it was not clear to whom Fernando was referring, it was true that around that time Stephanie had started flirting with other young men. And of course, in the school environment, the news quickly spread. Upon hearing the rumors, Vilma opposed the relationship between her daughter and Fernando. This became the cause of countless fights. Refusing to obey her mother, Stephanie continued to see Fernando in secret. On Saturday, January 11, 2014, just before noon, the girl snuck her boyfriend into her house. They then went up to the second floor, to her room, where they locked themselves in to watch TV and later had an intimate encounter. When Fernando's father noticed his son's absence, suspecting he had returned to Stephanie, he began calling him on the phone. Distracted, or perhaps anticipating his father's reproaches, Fernando did not answer. However, his father was not willing to give up, so he went to Stephanie's house to look for him. Once there, the man's shouts made Vilma come out of her room on the first floor. Although she ignored him and did not open the door, she immediately understood what was happening. Filled with anger, Vilma went upstairs and, without a word, broke into the room where her teenage daughter was with her boyfriend. It was at that moment that a fight broke out between the three, but it was an unequal struggle, as Fernando soon managed to immobilize the woman. At that moment, Stephanie delivered a strong blow to her mother's head. The force was such that Vilma fell to the floor, dying. Immediately after, the teenager placed the body under her bed, then Fernando and she went to the bathroom to clean themselves. At 90 years old and with senile dementia, Jose heard nothing and was unaware of anything. After that, Fernando went home. Later that same day, Stephanie kept in touch with dozens of people through her social media accounts. She confessed she felt that her heart was at peace and that her problems had finally ended, expressing the pleasurable feelings she was experiencing without specifying the reason. From that moment, Stephanie moved into her mother's room, which was about 10 meters away from hers. Additionally, she took the savings Vilma had, just over $10,000, and went on a shopping spree, spending as she pleased. 48 hours later, she posted a photo taken with her cell phone camera, in which she appeared wearing short floral pants and a pink blouse, holding a small puppy she had just bought in her right hand. She also paid for a change of style. As days passed, the teenager remained calm, even with her mother's decomposing body in the house. She continued to party with friends on several occasions. Jose, due to his health condition and advanced age, did not receive the care he needed from his daughter. When the smell from the second floor became unbearable, she and Fernando sprayed the room with various cleaning products and insecticides. They also partially covered the stained wall with black paint. Meanwhile, despite not being particularly friendly with them, the neighbors noticed that Vilma had not been seen watering the plants in her garden for a while. On January 16th, Stephanie called Fernando to tell him that 3 people were going to help her take out her mother's remains. According to his later testimony, Fernando suddenly felt a great repulsion towards his girlfriend, almost as if for the first time he fully understood what kind of person she was. He then decided to end their relationship. Although he no longer communicated with her or saw her, Stephanie tried to contact him in any way possible. Realizing that her text messages and calls were not being answered, the minor spoke with Marco, a cousin of Fernando's, and through him, she sent messages via one of her social media accounts. There, with encrypted messages, she asked him not to do anything foolish and not to say anything about what had happened. By that time, Vilma's loved ones had tried to contact her without success. Every time they asked Stephanie, she gave some excuse. After some time, they stopped believing her explanations and began to suspect that something had happened to her. In early March 2014, Vilma's relatives reported her strange disappearance to the authorities. Consequently, on the night of Sunday, March 9th of that year, the police arrived at the house with them. When they did not receive a satisfactory response from Stephanie about her mother's prolonged absence, the officers broke into the property with the family's authorization. Once inside, they found Stephanie nervously giving them the runaround in an attempt to hinder the authorities' progress. But the young woman's efforts were in vain, as the strong smell and the flies buzzing all over the place only heightened the police's worst fears. Upon turning the key to the room, the macabre scene was revealed in a matter of seconds. For 57 days, Vilma's body had been there, in the room of the daughter. Forensic experts at the scene found a knife, which was taken for analysis to determine if it had been used to kill Vilma. The authorities immediately considered Stephanie the main suspect in the crime. However, in her version of events, she tried to absolve herself of any responsibility and accused Fernando. Within minutes, reporters swarmed the surroundings of the house. The head of the Criminal Investigation Division informed the press of what was known so far, based on the minor's statements. Thus, both the motive and the cause of Vilma's death were still under investigation. The 65-year-old woman's body was transferred for forensic examinations. Meanwhile, news cameras managed to enter the house and obtained images of the teenager's room. There, marks on the floor were still visible, despite the presence of several bottles of different elements, presumably used to erase them. It wasn't until the following day, Monday, March 10, 2014, that the police formalized the request to initiate a process for violation of criminal law for the crimes committed by the 14-year-old minor. Consequently, Stephanie was forced to remain in a juvenile center for the duration of the process. In the early hours of Tuesday, amidst the tumult of reporters and neighbors, agents transferred Stephanie as some of those present shouted accusations at her. Due to her status as a minor, she wore her face semi-hidden with a cap. Nevertheless, she took advantage of the cameras and microphones to defend herself. During the police interrogation, Stephanie added more details to her version of events. This time she said that her mother became enraged upon discovering her with her boyfriend and then hit her with an iron bar. At that moment, Fernando came to her defense and attacked Vilma, injuring her in the left eye. They struggled, and then he pulled out a knife. She took the blade from him and tried to attack him, but he crawled away and with another blunt object hit Vilma 3 more times in the head. The story continued with Stephanie going to the bathroom to clean the wound her own mother had inflicted on her. By that time, Vilma was already showing no signs of life, and Fernando also approached the sink to wash off the traces of the crime they had just committed. In conclusion, Stephanie only admitted to hiding the body. A few hours later, after being summoned by the authorities, Fernando appeared at the police station to give his testimony. He arrived accompanied by his father and his lawyer. The detectives heard from the young man that all responsibility for the crime lay exclusively with Stephanie. Furthermore, Fernando claimed that the girl was tired of the constant physical abuse she suffered at the hands of her mother. The boy recounted that the teenager used the same bar with which her mom had hit her several times. However, Fernando's version did not convince the police either, as he made serious contradictions during the interrogation. Consequently, the police decided that the young man should be held as the suspected co-author and accomplice of the homicide. It was up to the prosecution to decide whether to charge him. On the afternoon of March 12th, 60 days after the crime, Vilma's body was removed from the morgue and was taken directly to the cemetery, where she was buried in the presence of family and friends. One of the victim's nieces called for the maximum penalty for the 2 minors involved, adding that for teenagers, it seemed all too easy to kill without facing responsibilities. She also mentioned that Stephanie was very much loved by her mother and denied there was a bad relationship between them. Meanwhile, the prosecution's decision led to Fernando's arrest. The teenager was placed in a juvenile center. Experts concluded that he was a young man with a tendency towards introversion, easily influenced by a figure that generated emotional attachment. They also indicated that Fernando submitted to his partner's wishes, allowing himself to be manipulated to satisfy her desires, showing himself submissive and compliant out of fear of emotional abandonment. Regarding Stephanie, forensic psychologists saw that the young woman had psychopathological traits in her personality. Amidst the twists and turns of the case, A television report revealed that Stephanie had been influenced by another girl who was in prison for killing her mother after a heated argument on March 5, 2005. It was also stated that Stephanie stored poems of her on a tablet or personal computer. At the end of March that same year, Stephanie insisted on her innocence through a letter. There, she explained that when she misbehaved and did not obey her mother, she was hit with a towel or a notebook, but not with an iron bar. An unexpected twist was her portrayal of Fernando, whom she accused of mistreatment and threats, even against his father. The reason was simple. He was obsessed with her and aimed to socially isolate her. Lastly, she assured that she loved and respected her mother and was overwhelmed with sadness from missing her father so much. In this story, Jose too was a victim of circumstances, even though he was unaware of what was happening around him. The elderly man was left at the mercy of Vilma's family. When the firstborn finally learned of the crime and traveled from Brazil, he found that Vilma's family refused to let him see his own father. After turning to the authorities, Jose's son was finally able to rescue him. He found his father in a state of neglect and uncleanliness, and they were unable to find his documents anywhere in the house. Consequently, his lawyer reiterated his request for the relevant agency to expedite the delivery of this documentation. Without it, neither Jose nor his son could claim his pension. The entire country remained attentive to any new detail, even those concerning the daily life of the main suspect. Once transferred to a new center, Stephanie made headlines again when it was revealed that she shared a third-year classroom with another minor accused of a similar crime, Rosalinda. Her case was also highly publicized in Peru. The young girl, who had suffered excessive abuse at the hands of her mother, retaliated against her and took her life. The director of the juvenile center told a Peruvian TV program that the two girls had no problems adapting to the group and also showed acceptable performance. According to her, as part of her job, it was not her place to judge them. Instead, it was necessary to do everything possible as a system to reintegrate them into society. The young women could be confined there until they turned 20, as Peruvian law only imposes a maximum of 6 years of readaptation in juvenile centers for crimes committed by minors. For adults, the country's legislation imposes up to 35 years of effective imprisonment for those responsible for these crimes. On the night of Thursday, April 10, 2014, the crime reconstruction took place. During this, the young woman smiled, made victory gestures, and showed no remorse. Fernando also participated, but, unlike Stephanie, chose not to speak to the press and preferred to hide his face, wearing a bulletproof vest at all times. Both arrived from their respective juvenile centers and had no contact with each other during the procedure. However, coldly and without showing regret, they attacked and accused each other. Upon leaving the scene, Stephanie began to play with her hair as the cameras from photographers and television stations focused on her. Meanwhile, Fernando's defense argued that the accusation against their client was full of contradictions. The psychological assessment of the crime scene, conducted by experts, found evidence of cruelty, planning, and simulation of the events, including the use of air fresheners and wall paint to hide blood traces. Days later, Jose visited his daughter for the first time. Still coming to terms with the events and remembering little, he hoped Stephanie would tell him everything. After leaving, following a 2-hour visit, he mentioned that his daughter blamed her former boyfriend for the crime, insisting to him that she was incapable of such evil. Jose carried with him a gift from his daughter, a pink heart saying she loved him. In the second half of April 2014, Stephanie's situation worsened when investigations into her cell phone uncovered threatening messages she had sent Fernando. These texts were retrieved by the young man's family for use in court, aiming to prove that Stephanie had planned the crime. By the end of July 2014, the prosecution formally charged Stephanie as the perpetrator of her mother's murder, with Fernando deemed an accomplice to the crime. In both cases, the public ministry requested 6 years of detention in a juvenile center and a compensation payment of $1,300. The prosecution's conclusions were based on the autopsy report, psychological assessments, and the crime scene psychological appraisal. Exclusive footage of Fernando in court was captured by a television camera. Walter, Fernando's father, was outraged by the verdict, insisting that there was no evidence incriminating his son. He believed that the inability to absolve Stephanie led to Fernando being charged as an accomplice. Contrary to the father's hopes, in October 2014, Fernando was sentenced to 4 years and 6 months in prison, while Stephanie received a 6-year sentence. After serving their sentences, Stephanie and Fernando were released, with no further updates on their lives made public. Yet, in Peru, the memory of this shocking story lingers, a story of a daughter whose miraculous birth filled her parents with joy, only to later become a figure far from the angel they had dreamt of spending their final years with. Once again, dear audience, I thank you for your company. If you haven't subscribed yet, I warmly invite you to do so and become part of this great community. This is Unreal True Crime. Until our next episode, good night.